Good morning, and welcome to Our Business Too, Democracy and Private Enterprise Delivering Together, an official side event of the Summit for Democracy. My name is Andrew Wilson, and I'm the Executive Director of CIPE, Center for International Private Enterprise. Based in Washington, D.C., CIPE is an NGO working at the intersection of economic growth, entrepreneurship, good governance, and democracy in emerging and frontier markets around the globe. Our mission is to strengthen democracy through private enterprise and market-oriented reform, advancing a vision of a world where democracy delivers the freedom and opportunity for all to prosper. Like President Biden and his administration, CIPE is committed to advancing democracy worldwide. That's why we're honored to partner in organizing today's event. Today, we'll focus on the role of a unique group of stakeholders in democracy and civil society, the private sector, which is CIPE's core constituency. And this morning, we're pleased to bring together representatives of the private sector from the world's largest corporations to leading entrepreneurs in emerging markets. We'll discuss why business needs democracy to thrive and why democracy is made stronger by a thriving private sector. Why do business and democracy go hand in hand? Well, it's because the institutions and values of democracy, rule of law, good governance, transparency and freedom from corruption, freedom of information, citizens' rights to petition their leaders, and more, allow business to thrive. By the same token, when business thrives, creating jobs and opportunity and building an inclusive and sustainable economy, citizens can live in a society that delivers prosperity, and they become true stakeholders in democracy. Today, we're pleased to present a stellar lineup of speakers and 3 exciting panels that will delve deeper into these connections. We'll examine the topics of responsible investment, beneficial ownership transparency, and ensuring digital spaces are both open and well-governed. And at the conclusion of today's session, we'll ask each of you to think about what you can do, both through your firms and as citizens in democracies, to advance a democratic agenda in the coming year and beyond. To kick us off, we're extremely honored to be joined by U.S. Secretary of Commerce, Gina Raimondo, to share the administration's perspective on how the government and private sector can best collaborate to advance democracy and prosperity. Following her remarks, the Secretary will be joined for conversation with 2 corporate leaders whose companies are at the forefront of the issues we'll be discussing today. Kent Walker, President of Global Affairs at Google and Alphabet, and Patrick Collison, CEO of Stripe. Madam Secretary, the floor is yours.
Good morning, and thank you, Andrew. It is my great pleasure to be here this morning hosting this incredibly important discussion and having an important role here in the Summit for Democracy. So, as Andrew just said very well, businesses flourish when democracies flourish. And democracies flourish in growth-oriented business environments. Democracies flourish when people have the opportunity to have access to technology and have decent jobs. And certainly businesses flourish in countries that have openness, transparency, a rule of law, and when businesses don't have to compete against governments or autocracies. And so what this morning's session is about, and kicking off a year-long discussion, is how we, the government, can work closely with each other and our allies and other governments around the world, but also the critical role of the private sector. And so I am thrilled to be here to have this discussion with 2 business leaders focused on the role of the private sector and businesses and tech companies specifically in helping us to ensure that democracy flourishes all over the world. First, let me touch on a few things that we in the government are doing. So later this week, the U.S. will be announcing an effort on export controls and human rights. The president will be announcing that later this week. This announcement will be the beginning of our efforts and will be followed by coordination and consultations in coordination with our partners to engage as many governments as we can around the world in this important effort. We're also working with our like-minded partners around the world to lead on tech priorities that affect all democracies. a few things briefly to mention. First, the leaders from the US, Australia, India, and Japan announced new efforts that together will advance critical and emerging technologies. Second, through the TTC, Trade and Technology Council, which we launched last year with the EU, the US and the EU are working together to come up with shared principles and areas for collaboration on key global technologies, including export controls. And third, we've launched a new bilateral cooperative partnerships that reinforce these democratic principles, including efforts on critical and emerging technologies with Japan and Singapore. So this is what we are doing as a government and among governments to advance this work. But today and this morning and this session is about the private sector. What role can the private sector, what role can businesses, what role can entrepreneurs and tech leaders and tech investors play in this critical work? And I will say, as a Commerce Secretary, I am committed to engaging all of you in the months ahead in this work. Businesses have enormous impacts on democracy and the determination of whether democracies flourish. Businesses, through your day-to-day operations, through your business models, and through your public engagements, through your ability and willingness to speak out against human rights abuses. And business actions directly can support this summit's goals of tackling authoritarianism, combating corruption, and promoting human rights. At the beginning of the internet and some of the technological advancement, these technologies were human rights enabling, were citizen enabling. But unfortunately, increasingly, we are seeing technology used not for good. And so the whole point of this is to counter that digital authoritarianism and to make sure that our emerging technologies are used for good in the promotion of human rights and freedom and transparency and democracy, and not used to promote autocracy and digital authoritarianism. And we are committed to this, the President is committed to this, and we believe there's a very important role for the private sector to play. So with that, it is now my great pleasure to introduce two business leaders. Patrick Collison, the CEO of Stripe, one of the fastest growing, most successful tech startups. I put that in quotes because I think you've grown beyond a startup at this point, Patrick. And Kent Walker, head of global affairs for Google. I think it's very early in the morning for you guys, and I appreciate you coming in for this important discussion. So Patrick, I want to start with... Yeah, thank you, and thank you, Kent. So Patrick, I want to start with you this morning. You've come from Ireland to the U.S. Your company now operates in the U.S., headquartered in San Francisco and Dublin. I know you've spoken quite a lot on this topic of what business can do to counter digital authoritarianism. So maybe we can just start with you. Tell me what you see as the relationship between democracy and innovation.
Sure. Well, first, just thank you so much for your leadership on these topics. There's been this debate in the economic literature for the past couple of decades as to what exactly the relationship is between democracy and long-run economic growth and innovation and so on. There's this paper from Darren Esamoglu a couple of years ago, and he suggests that maybe democracies. The kind of measured effect he found was that democracies produce maybe 20% more GDP per capita growth over a quarter-century period. That's a significant effect size. But the analysis that I really liked from a couple of years ago was one by Rui Tang, based out of Hong Kong. And what he described as a mechanism where democracies better support bottom-up institutional innovation bottom-up change and creativity across society, such that the value of democracy is actually greater. So the more affluent a country becomes, and he does a bunch of analysis here and finds this is in fact consistent with and supported by the data. And this really appealed to me because this is very much the Stripe experience. Stripe is a financial services company. What we do is very complicated, and we would only be able to pursue the innovation that we do with clear frameworks, clear rule of law, and most importantly, an institutional disposition that tries to welcome new ways of doing things rather than simply trying to buttress and protect the status quo. And then maybe even more importantly, or kind of more saliently, Stripe is now one of the largest platforms for entrepreneurship in the world. And across our millions of customers, we see that in so many cases, they're challenging some favored incumbent or trying to do introduce new product or service that's different to that which has prevailed. And it's, again, only with this kind of participatory, inclusive, and sort of innovation-minded society, the kind that tends to prevail in a democracy, that our users would be able to do what they do. So I think these clear frameworks and this kind of support for bottom-up innovation is maybe the clearest linkage. And then just the other one to say, because I guess I've been such a beneficiary of it, I'm as you pointed out, I grew up in Ireland, and now have the great fortune to be here in the US on a green card. My partner grew up in Switzerland. She's a scientist. She works in CRISPR. She's in the US on an H-1B. And I think that people who want to take a crack at doing things somewhat differently, or to innovate in some capacity, they want to do so in a free, liberal, and democratic society. That's been clearly evident through history. I think that the ability of any society to successfully pursue long-run innovation and growth will be closely linked to its democratic status. And so we both consider ourselves very lucky to be here.
Thank you. And we, of course, are very lucky to have you here. So Kent, over to you. As I said in the introduction, it was once thought that technology and the internet was inherently democratizing. And now, of course, we see technology used to stifle dissent, for surveillance, in all kinds of kind of anti-democratic, malicious ways. So in your view, what is the role for technology to promote democracy, and also the role of tech leaders and businesses in doing that?
I mean, you're absolutely right. We're seeing this rising tide of challenges around the world. And I think it puts the question very squarely. Democracies have traditionally been great at the open exchange of ideas, collaboration, risk-taking. As you said in your opening remarks, these are all the things that not only made business thrive, but I would say led to incredible advances in science, in technology. So on the flip side, how can, if you look at the history from steam engines to search engines, there is this notion that technology actually helps democracies deliver on their promise to people, that there are new opportunities, there are increased opportunities for everybody. Lifespan in this last century has doubled. The internet has lowered prices for people across the economy. At a time when we're in this global battle for ideas, are democracies better than authoritarian regimes? Can they actually make life better for their people? I think it's critical for us to be able to say what are the specific ways technology is helping? And that can be helping governments innovate. Estonia is working on its smart connectivity project. But more broadly, it's the whole of the economy. How does digitization lower prices? How does it help with things like life-saving developments in the mRNA vaccines that we've seen? The larger challenges ahead, sustainability, agricultural productivity, clean water for people around the world. I know that you and many of the leaders in government are wrestling with this tension we have right now between the economy shifting from the just-in-time, efficient but fragile supply chains to just-in-case, which is a less efficient but maybe more robust approach. Technology can actually help cut that Gordian knot. And there are ways of actually making use of digitization to more efficiently and more robustly take advantage of all the components of the economy. Now, Challenges are inevitable whenever you develop new technologies. But if we can master that, if we can come up with sensible, aligned regulation, that will help democracies rally together to preserve the openness that's actually been their traditional greatest strength.
Yeah, it's openness and it's also inclusivity. The growth has to be, for democracy to flourish, which is good for business, the growth and innovation has to be accessible to everybody, not just a few. So Kent, you've been at this for a long time, you're a leader in it. What makes you optimistic? You've identified some challenges, but what makes you optimistic that technology, as we go forward, will be able to promote and sustain democracies?
I mean, we are seeing some astonishing things on the horizon. I've been at Google 15 years. The internet's been a force around the world for coming on 30 years. The promise of artificial intelligence, which effectively can help us predict the future, from what you're going to type in Gmail to the next move of Go, to improving retail supply chains or energy efficiency. Quantum computing, what our engineers here call the language of nature, helping us with material science, nuclear fusion, really just unlocking these solutions for a next generation of challenges. That's incredibly exciting. And we need to get that right. So what does it mean for the triumph of democratic values, for the openness and freedom and the things we've talked about? I would say in many ways, the internet embodies many of those values. It has been a way of empowering voices around the world, letting people connect, giving everybody their own printing press. Now, there's a counter move afoot out there. Freedom House recently came out with a study showing that 48 different governments around the world have been pushing in the opposite direction, shutting down access to information, limiting the ability of their people to speak out. I think it's a critical time for democracy not to turn inward. We really have to do the reverse. We have to come together and step up and make the case that democratic values matter, that democratic values work. To do that, you need to have what democracy should be good at, open and honest debates. There are tensions of privacy versus competition, free expression, and social responsibility. But that constructive debate is what we do when we're at our best. So, I mean, that's why we really appreciate you setting up this summit, this multi-stakeholder, multilateral gathering. Because that's exactly, I think, what it takes. Building on efforts like the Trade and Technology Council to help democracies hash out those tough questions and then move forward together on a path to the future.
Thank you, thank you. So picking up on what Kent just said, Patrick, what's the role of business, technology, tech leaders and tech entrepreneurs in doing what Kent said, which is to say, making the case for democracy and pushing back on digital authoritarianism and the misuse of technology and digital tools to, stifle freedom and democracy?
Well, to what you just said about the importance of inclusiveness in this economic growth, I always love the point that Deirdre McCluskey makes about how sort of capitalism as a concept gets misconstrued. It's not about capital. The core of it is, in fact, an open, inclusive, universal system that enables people from every background to have a go at things. But on the role of the private sector here, I suppose the first thing I'd say is I think the private sector should think about these questions. There's sometimes this position of, to my mind, inappropriate neutrality and sort of, deeming this beyond the remit of the company, which I don't think is exactly or necessarily true. I think the private sector has long been a participant in the transmission of American values and global liberal values and democratic values, and I think that's fully appropriate. I'm personally very influenced by having, of course, grown up in Ireland, and in particular seeing the partnership between government and democratically elected representatives and the private sector that propelled Ireland to prosperity over the course of several decades in the latter half of the 20th century. And again, sort of any sense that that government and the private sector can't work harmoniously and effectively together on these topics is certainly sort of rebutted by, to my mind, the Irish experience. I think the basic role of private sector here is, as you pointed out at the beginning, to create a more prosperous, inclusive, and affluent society. Global median income is still just about $5,000 a year. And so I think maybe the single best thing that the private sector can do is to support the innovation and creation and entrepreneurship that'll advance living standards across the world. I think the private sector should think of democracy, somewhat as we do other pillars of civic infrastructure. In that, when we consider entering some market or operating in some country, an unreliable electricity supply would certainly give us pause, and we certainly wouldn't, deem that, beyond the realm of that which should be considered. And in a similar vein, I think it is absolutely correct and appropriate for us to weigh the civic, democratic, and governance norms. And then just the last thing I'll say is, as the private sector, I think it's very important that we approach all of this with humility, and sort of humility on multiple axes. Humility with respect to the effects of our products in the world, because that's not always fully foreseeable. As the line goes, it's one thing to invent electricity, but it's hard, given that invention, to predict rock music. And also humility in terms of our ability to shape that which happens around them. I think we have to think broadly about that which is appropriate for our role. And then lastly, I think we have to show up and engage in that there's maybe a historical sense that Silicon Valley can do its thing, or the tech sector can do its thing, and government will separately act in its own capacity. And I guess the Stripe view, and maybe again this is influenced by our being financial services, is it has to be a partnership from the outset. And we work closely with a lot of government agencies, and we have very productive relationships with them. And I think it's much better to see that as something that should be pursued in joint partnership rather than separately from our respective coasts.
Yeah. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have. I can't thank you enough for this. I'm going to conclude with what you just said, Patrick: show up and engage. So I am today inviting the private sector, tech leaders, and the business sector to show up and engage with us in the government over the next year and beyond. And I am committing to you that we will be open and inviting of private sector feedback and engagement, because we need to do this together. So thank you both so much.
Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Madam Secretary, and Mr. Walker and Mr. Collison, for that insightful and inspiring conversation, and for showing up and engaging. I think that's a great theme for today's event. Madam Secretary, we appreciate your clear articulation of the U.S. government's compelling vision of how democracy and business are mutually reinforcing, as well as the ways in which democratic values and institutions will ensure a prosperous and inclusive economy. Kent and Patrick, you've reminded us that business and democracy have a symbiotic relationship, and have shown how Google and Stripe serve as the fertile soil upon which so much commerce takes place and benefits humanity. Your teams at Google and Stripe are truly leaders in a new area of good corporate citizenship.